Imagine this. It's December 2nd, 1993 in Medellín. A man is running across a terracotta roof, barefoot, out of breath, a phone still warm in his hand from the call that just got him killed. 12 months earlier, he was the seventh richest man on the planet. Today, he's 44 years old, one day past his birthday, hunted by three different armies, and about to become a bullet ridden headline. This is the story of Pablo Escobar. And I'm not telling the story to glorify him, of course not. But I'm telling it because buried inside one of the most violent criminal enterprises in history is a masterclass in ambition, strategy, and leadership. Sitting right next to that blueprint is how ambition can destroy you if you don't put guardrails on it. There are three things that he got right to build an empire that we can certainly apply today, and three things that he got catastrophically wrong. We're going to look at this through the lens of business, of leadership, of psychology. This is not a history lesson. I'm sure we can very quickly find who Pablo Escobar is and all the insane crimes that he committed. But we're going to look beyond that. We're going to look and learn by being curious into one of the most well-known figures in history. And what can we take away from that? Part one, the rise. One of the biggest lessons that I found from looking into Pablo Escobar is that he found the arbitrage before anyone else. Pablo was making a decent living smuggling tobacco and booze, and then he realized that just one truck of cocaine could earn far more than 40 trucks of tobacco. A kilo of cocaine around that time cost about $1,500 to produce in Colombia and could be sold in the US for around $50,000. This is the single decision that turned a small time smuggler into the man who will eventually make Forbes billionaire list 7 times. He's not the first Colombian, however, or criminal at least, to move contraband. He's just the first to look at it from a different angle by looking at the actual unit economics of what he's smuggling and realizing that there's a more optimal way of delivering that product. And that's kind of the whole insight. He didn't get smarter overnight. He just did the math that nobody else was bothered to be able to do on a product that nobody else, or possibly everybody else, was probably just too scared to touch. This is the first thing to steal from him. Obviously, it's not the crime, but it's the instinct. The biggest wins in any market don't come from grinding harder at the same game as everyone else. It comes from noticing the gap between what something is worth here and what something is worth there before the gap closes. If I use the personal training industry as an example, there is a certain amount that you can charge in person, personal trainer, any real type of coaching. That requires your time, effort, you showing up to a location, client showing up to a location, being able to train that. If you, for example, want to charge high prices, you're most likely going to work in a major city. That comes with it generally travel. You're not unlikely to be probably staying in the middle of New York City or staying in the middle of Sydney unless you've got an insane amount of cash. Some kind of travel, there's parking, there's trains, there's potentially Ubers, buses. There is rent that you're going to have to pay if you have your own facility there. Like, it's fucking expensive. But if you take that same client, let's say you've got a 60-minute session, and this is many of the people listening to this that have done stuff in major cities. I spent a long time doing it in Sydney, so let's use Sydney as an example. Let's say you've got a 60-minute session. It's $200 for the session, which is not uncommon. $200 for the session. That same session for 60 minutes, you could still charge a decent amount of cash for that client. And instead of it being $200 a session, let's say they do three sessions a week. That's 180 minutes. That's 3 hours of personal training, $600. You could service that same client in an online space by saying, I'm going to, instead of programming those 3 sessions for you, doing your nutrition and your check-ins, I'm going to do it in the online space. And instead of paying me the $600, let's say it's 50% of that, you're going to pay me $300 for the week $1,200 a month instead of $2,400 a month, so it's 50%. But I'm going to give you your workouts for the entire week. I'm going to give you 5 minutes workout, your nutrition, your check-ins, etc. Which, in some respects, might seem like, well, you're not earning quite as much money. But two things happen here. You don't have the headache of the travel, which is nice. If you're paying rent, for example, you don't have to do that, which is saving you a fortune. Although you are learning less, you are servicing that client in much less time. You're not going to be spending 3 hours a week on that particular client. If you look at check-ins, potentially trading this on the upper end, changing programs, creating new meal plans, etc., you're looking at that particular client. It might take a third of that time, 3 hours. So it might take you an hour, let's say, topside. So now you've got 300 for the hour. And if you have 2 people, 3 people for that, you end up earning more because you don't have those overheads. You can still charge a good amount of money, service the client in third of the time, and you don't have those overheads. So looking at training, not in-person coaching, you can look in the online space as a kind of a real world example of this. Lesson 2, he owned the entire chain, not just a piece of it. Rather than staying one link in somebody else's supply chain, Escobar pushed to control production straight through to distribution and sale. Taking the operational international is what turned his millions into probably billions. By the mid-1980s, the Medellín cartel controlled more than 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Not because Escobar was the only supplier, because he'd built and in many cases personally flown the planes, bought the routes, and controlled the distribution networks on the other end. He was known for a strong DIY ethos. Learned to fly his own planes, find his own smuggling routes rather than outsourcing the parts of the business he didn't understand. That's a founder who refuses to be dependent on anyone else's competence for the parts of the business that matter the most. Most people who get a foothold in the market stay there. Escobar didn't. He went backward and forward, integrated the entire chain, understood production, transport, distribution, even sometimes the politics protected it because he understood that every layer you don't control is a layer that somebody else is going to tax you on. His private stay outside Medellin cost roughly $63 million back then to build. It included 27 artificial lakes, a private airstrip, a bull ring, whatever you need a bull ring for, life-size concrete dinosaurs, a zoo stocked with animals, including elephants, giraffes, hippos, smuggled in abroad his own drug planes. Those hippos matter far more than colour. After his death, they escaped the property, adapted to the local river, and now number in the hundreds. Strange, literally living the legacy of the empire that he built. So the lesson to take away here is to understand the entire chain. It is to understand every part of your business, from sales, marketing, client delivery, from your SOPs, like your standard operating procedures. It is to be able to understand every single aspect of your business. And by doing so, you start to gain control over that. Because if you know there is a problem occurring in a department and you've already done that and you understand that, instead of looking at the marketing, for example, saying, why aren't these ads performing well? You can take a look at the ads and go, here's why I think they aren't performing well. Here's why our ROAS isn't the way that it should be or the level that we want it to be. What do we need to do in order to be able to rectify that? If anyone heard the loud noise outside, thought it was gunshots going off. Bit creepy doing a Pablo Escobar episode, but it's some knobhead on his motorbike. If you've got a motorbike and you're a gearhead, don't rev it outside windows where kids are. You sound like a twat, and it's really fucking annoying as well. Sorry, slight little tangent there. Understand the whole supply chain. Understand every part of the business so that you can help solve that versus stressing out because you don't understand why things aren't working. Lesson 3, calculated risk. Obsessive downside planning. He planned the routes meticulously. He bought strategic influence where he needed it and stayed constantly aware of what every rival and enemy was doing. In 1991, facing extradition to the US, Escobar didn't run. He negotiated. Under the terms he struck with the Colombian government, he would serve a maximum of 5 years and critically could not be extradited, and he got to design and build his own prison. The result was La Catedral. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly for my Mexican and Spanish listeners. A compound with a football pitch, a jacuzzi, a casino, disco, waterfall, and a private suite with a rotating bed, staffed entirely by his own handpicked guards. He negotiated the terms of his own incarceration down to the furniture. That isn't recklessness. That is a man who plans for every outcome, including capture. Here's the distinction that people make around risk takers who actually win in the long term. It was never blind aggression. Every move was paired with a downside plan. He didn't gamble, he calculated, and then he acted decisively. That's a combination almost nobody actually has. It's the appetite for big bets and the discipline to plan for the bet going wrong. Escobar built his Robin Hood image deliberately, funding hospitals, football stadiums, and housing for the poor. 1982, after visiting a garbage dump called Moravia, where hundreds of families lived without basic services, he gave housing vouchers to roughly 400 families and moved them into a new neighborhood. A place still known today, unofficially, as Barrio Pablo Escobar. That neighborhood still has close to 13,000 residents, and locals still refer to him as Don Pablo. This is where you can be honest with the people that you serve. This is where you can be honest with them and understand that there is always going to be a deeper layer of yourself that you can share. Understand that there might be downsides to that, and this is where you can be selective, I guess, on what you want to share. But I find that the more honest that you are, the more human you become. In Pablo Escobar, like an absolute monster on one hand, but gave so much to so many people on the other, which is something you don't really expect from a tyrant. It was that strategy that allowed him to be able to take a poor community who had nothing and be able to still help and to still serve them. And this is part of the reason I wanted to go into let some lessons with Pablo Escobar. Is like, on one hand, he's a complete monster, and if you didn't look deeper, you would go, yeah, this guy's like a fucking nutcase. He deserved what he got. But on the other hand, he was a human that helped. So let's look into the term. La Catedral becomes a visual proof that the empire has outgrown any system built to contain it. In July 1992, Escobar summoned two lieutenants he suspected of skimming cartel money to the prison and had them killed inside its walls. One beaten to death with a pool cue. That reminds me, this kind of Dark Knight vibes. Heath Ledger playing the Joker. If anybody understands that reference, please leave me a comment, let me know. When the government tried to quietly move him to a real prison, he took a government official hostage and warned by a phone call from his wife that soldiers were approaching, escaped through a tunnel he'd built into the compound during its construction. Everything that built the empire is about to come the exact thing that tears it down. Watch how fast the same instinct flips from asset to liability. The fall. Downfall lesson 1. Violence as a strategy has no ceiling. In 1984, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began publicly exposing Escobar's criminal ties and pushing him out of politics. 3 months after Escobar retired from politics under that pressure, Lara Bonilla was assassinated on his orders. That single kill triggered the Colombian government to immediately sign extradition to the US into law, turning a political embarrassment into an existential war with the state. From there, it escalates fast. Escobar formed a group called Los Extraditables. God, it's hard to pronounce these on the fly without looking at them before you say it. With the slogan, "We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison in the United States." The campaign of terror that followed included an assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Guillen in 1989, when Guillen's successor, Cesar Gaviria, became the next target. Escobar had a bomb planted aboard Avancia Flight 203, a commercial passenger flight, hoping to kill Gaviria, who ended up not boarding the plane. The bombing killed 107 people aboard. 9 days later, a truck bomb outside the headquarters of Colombia's security agency killed dozens more and hundreds injured. Fear is a lever. It works. People have been feared to many things. If you look at the way governments run and media runs. Fear causes us to do crazy shit. Depending on what everyone's individual thoughts are on the COVID vaccinations and that crazy, crazy time, we acted out of fear. There were people when I was, it was crazy in Australia, that were, we had to ration out toilet paper because there was people leaning into fear and buying packs and packs and packs of toilet roll, afraid, fearing that they would run out. And the crazy thing is about that, it's like if you don't at least join them a little bit, they obviously put bans on it. They said one to each shop. But if you don't join them a little bit, you end up suffering, which is this the human mentality. And again, depending on what your thoughts are on that particular time, and I've spoken of this at length previously, is the thing that I disagreed the most wasn't masks, it wasn't vaccinations, it was the fact that free will was stripped away from us in a second, and we weren't allowed to do anything about it. And as soon as you did stand up for yourself, you were kind of shunned by everybody else, including the people around you. But yet, even during that time, and even now, people don't know exactly why it started, where it started, exactly the long-term implications of it. We were rushed to create a vaccination that, again, depending on who you believe and what you read into, that was there to drive capitalism and put money in the pockets of a few people, including, I think it was the CEO of Pfizer at the time, said that we actually don't know if that vaccination is going to work. I think there was text messages or something leaked out, and he admitted it as well. We actually don't know if it's going to work. We were just told to make this shit happen faster, basically, to get it out there. But anyway, that's a podcast for another time. But fear, making us do crazy shit. Lesson 2 is no exit strategy. Even after building like a catedral, a prison with a nightclub in it, there's no version of the story where Escobar actually stops. By 1991, a decade of accumulating enemies was already causing his world to collapse around him. A vigilante group called Los Pepas, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, made up of rivals and people he'd wronged, would go on to assassinate more than 300 of his associates and family members. Every quote-unquote win, every rival eliminated, every judge bribed, every escape just raised the stakes instead of banking the gains. He never once at any point of the wealth or the power seemed to define what enough looked like. That's a trap that catches ambitious people who aren't Colombian drug lords too. You get so good at playing the game that you forget the entire point was to eventually win and step away, or potentially even playing the infinite game to fall in love with something and just continue to play. But if you never define what enough looks like, the game ends up defining it for you, and the game is infinite, so the game never ends. And the game doesn't have your best interest at heart. It is purely, it just is. So it's important, I think, to be able to determine what you want. And Ramit Sethi has a great way of doing this, is defining your rich life. What does that look like for you? It doesn't necessarily, although it does include money, what does that look like? Is it a case of you're happy to buy secondhand clothes to go on an expensive holiday, or you want to keep it up with the Joneses? You want to make sure that you are seen as a particular thing or a particular person in society. So you live lavishly, but you have to then look at your income and expenses. You have to try and scheme somewhere else. You have to reduce overheads somewhere else. So having an idea of a rich life or an exit strategy is a really good idea. Downfall lesson 3, the last one here. Power without accountability turns inward. By late 1993, Escobar wasn't living in Hacienda Napoles or the Monaco penthouse anymore. He was hiding in a modest middle-class house in Medellín suburbia called Los Olivos, peeling paint, tile roofs, nothing like the empire that he built. On December 1st, his 44th birthday, he celebrated quietly with marijuana, cake, and wine. He spent that birthday on the phone with his children, talking, laughing, singing, staying on the line longer than it was safe. For the first time in months, letting his guard down. The next day, still trying to reach his family, made another call, one that ran past the 2-minute mark. He knew it was dangerous, and Colombia's search block triangulated the signal. Officers surrounded the house. Escobar and his bodyguard rode for the rooftop. Both were killed, and gunfire that followed. Escobar hit Once in the head, dead instantly. The man most feared in the atmosphere, the architect of a war that killed thousands, was found because he couldn't stop being a father for one phone call too long. The same hypervigilance that built the empire, trust no one, stay unreachable, control everything, is the same thing that just had to slip just once for the person underneath it to come through. He slipped on a phone call to his kids. There's no version of unaccountable power that doesn't eventually isolate you from being completely untouchable. He built an empire out of people, and the empire's last act was to trace one call that would let him be himself, let him be the human. Pablo Escobar didn't fail because he lacked ambition or vision, or the ability to execute. He failed because he never built any guardrails into the pursuit. Yes, there's some moral and ethical challenges that he did not have, but if you don't build guardrails in, if you don't understand why you're doing or what you want to achieve out of it, you end up succumbing to life, succumbing to the game of life. And oftentimes, I think in 2026 is where we look unto others, and we simply just follow. We're very much the sheep-like mentality. We just follow other people. We see someone that has something that we kind of like, so we just follow. We see an influencer, we just follow. We see an athlete, we just follow. Instead of taking some time to be bored, take some time to be able to think ourselves and go, what do I actually want? What do I want out of this life? What am I trying to achieve out of spending time here on this earth? These are all the important questions. I think these are important questions to be able to ask frequently. So then you really start to understand yourself, because once you can do that, life becomes much more fun. Hope you enjoy.